Hey everyone, welcome back to Dev Interrupted. I am delighted to be joining you live from DevOps Enterprise Summit. I am your host, Conor Bronsdon, and I'm joined by one of my good friends, the head of developer relations for LinearB, Ben Lloyd Pearson. Ben, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here. It's been great energy so far at the event. I'm really looking forward to just getting through the rest of it.
Yeah, we had a really fantastic opportunity to kick it off at the Dora Community Summit. I know we want to get into a bit about what we learned there, some of the conversations we had. It was very informative. And one of the things that we've been hearing a lot about here is about programmable workflows, which is something that we're very passionate about. And you in particular have a lot of depth on that. You're building out the free tooling that LinearB is doing for initiating programmable workflows and applying policy as code for organizations. Can you start off by defining for the audience what programmable workflows are? And then let's dig into a bit about why they matter so much.
Yeah, I think what it really comes down to is giving developers the tools that they need to configure, program, design all the sorts of automations, tooling that they need to get software from an idea to deployment into production. So, one area that's done very well in this area is CI/CD. There's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of established practices and processes, a lot of automation. A lot of the toil that developers used to have to spend has now been sort of automated away from them, but using conventions that are very familiar to them. It's configurations, it's coding, it's stuff like that. So we've spent a lot of time focusing sort of earlier in the process than CI/CD. We've been promoting this idea of continuous merge, which applies, more of that mentality to like the code review process. So a little bit earlier upstream from like the CI/CD system, and that's sort of opposed to some of the other workflows that developers might have to deal with day to day. Like, for example, every team has a project management software. Most developers don't really like using it. They know they have to.
I love Jira. What are you talking about?
Yeah, man, it's a beast. It can be amazing, but it terrifies developers.
Valid.
And it's a big context switch. So anything you can do to make it easier for them to interact with that in a way that's more natural. That's sort of what we're proposing. And, there's also a lot of interest that I've seen around like regulatory and compliance as well. There's a lot of things that you sort of need to make sure your organization is following, especially if you're like in a highly regulated industry, like if you're in banking or something like that, or insurance. So I've also seen, just so far at this event, there's been a real big interest in having like policy as code, programmable workflows that make sure your organization is mitigating risks associated with delivering software. So let's dig into that a little bit. What would
be a great example of leveraging programmable workflows to create policy as code and maybe help with compliance or security concerns?
Yeah, so if you have parts of your code base that need extra scrutiny, or it impacts user data, or it potentially could open up security vulnerabilities, you want to make sure that you have the right processes in place, both to catch those, but then there's always situations where you might need exceptions. So having systems built in place to prevent people from getting blocked within those processes. So
an example of that might be, let's say we're looking at a part of the code base that we've identified is highly compliance. There's a high degree of importance to compliance there. Maybe, to your point, it deals with user data. Maybe you want to add an additional reviewer who sits on a certain security team or compliance team to add additional reviews to those PRs. And you're saying we can automate that process or other approaches to it based on however you want to configure your workflows.
Yeah, I mean, imagine if you asked a developer every time that they needed to get an exception to a policy to manually go through and figure out which policies are applicable and flag the appropriate people. Like, that's never going to scale. It's never going to be successful. So you want to make sure that it's as automated as possible, so that you don't miss anything, and that you're not just putting toil on your developers that distracts them from the stuff they are you hire them to do.
Do you see this implementation of programmable workflows as something that developers are going to be pushed to do in order to implement policy as code in the coming years?
Yeah, so I almost think it potentially is going to be both ways. I think there's going to be a lot of scenarios where where an organization might, for example, want to get SOC 2 compliance, and in a situation like that, it's the decision's probably made at the executive level. They're going to push down all of those requirements. And myself, I don't know much about SOC 2, but I know when someone comes knocking on my door and says we need to do this to get prepared for it, then I know I have to,
Yes.
I have to prioritize that. There's no debate around that. But you can't really expect me, or you can't really expect a developer to know, when they're potentially at risk of stepping out of the bounds. So a great way to do that is just to have some sort of automation that flags anything that looks like a SOC 2 concern, so that when you have to go back and verify that you do follow those practices, like you have some like verifiable proof. But then you also have the reverse of that. I think there's a lot of developers who face a lot of challenges, particularly around the code review process. There's a lot of delays that happen in that area. And a lot of the fixes are their developers scratching their own itch. They don't like waiting on PRs to get picked up for a long time. They don't like having to come back to review code days after they submitted it for review. So in those situations, I think there's also very much a bottoms-up appeal.
I'm glad you brought up the code review process, because this is such an important friction point in the software development lifecycle, and we're seeing that come through in the research data. So we did our 2023 engineering benchmarks report, and we clearly saw that there were challenges in code review, particularly for some large organizations. And it's also very clear that when you can merge code faster and kind of speed up that cycle time, you're just able to deliver more value. And it's something that was also followed up by the 2023 DORA report, which we partnered with Google on. And they actually found that faster code reviews were indicative of 50% higher software delivery performance, a major reason why LinearB has focused in on code reviews as this key friction point to improve. Can you dive into a bit about how gitStream is trying to approach this, and why LinearB is so focused on this key area?
Yeah, so we fortunately have a lot of data around this, which puts us in a really great position to have some fairly strong opinions about it. And one of the things we know is, after looking at, I think, more than 4 million PRs at this point that have been processed through our platform, the thing that consistently comes up as the biggest slowdown in the software delivery process is around the code review process. So developers write code really quickly. Once it's been reviewed, it tends to get merged quickly. The CI/CD systems tend to be pretty good at getting it deployed to production relatively fast. All of the testing and everything we have, it tends to be pretty good for ensuring quality and efficiency. But there isn't really a lot of solutions out there on the market for people who are facing challenges with code reviews. And what we found is that some teams, a lot of teams are waiting multiple days just to get someone to look at a code review. And if it's a small fix, that's demoralizing for a developer. Every developer wants to do their part to fix whatever they can. And if they make a small improvement, but it doesn't get any attention for days, that's demoralizing. But it's also just, if it is a complicated fix that you have to come back to, there's a massive context switch that only gets worse the longer that takes. So, the difference between getting feedback the same day on code you wrote versus a week later is massive in terms of productivity. And yeah, sure, developers will do other things while waiting on the reviews, but there's always going to be that context switch that you want to avoid.
Spend that time to get your brain back in gear and go, okay, the notes that I wrote in this code, what the heck did they mean again? What was I doing here?
Yeah, and not to mention, there's lots of things that, lots of practices that maybe they're not clear within the organization, so developers might run afoul of things that need to be flagged. And so the first review could be that it's just a developer saying, hey, you missed these couple of things that maybe you weren't aware of, or we just changed this and we haven't communicated it or whatever. But that causes another cycle, Yeah. So yeah, that's why we made gitStream, because we wanted to find a way to help developers find reviewers, get them assigned, get reviews through more quickly, unblock things that aren't as risky. And then make sure that any sort of criteria or requirements that you have for your code base are being considered before you have any sort of human spend their time to interact with it.
This speaks to that policy as code use case we talked about earlier, of maybe you're a financial institution and you want to make sure certain PRs in certain parts of the code base are treated in certain ways. And it's interesting you bring up what we're seeing in the data, because it has been really clear in LinearB's quantitative data, but we're also seeing a ton of qualitative signal. So not only did the DORA report highlight PRs and has highlighted code reviews for a couple of years now, but we've also seen it with Every major enterprise we talk to, if the Netflixes, the Metas of the world, they have custom tooling they're building internally. Maybe it's not as configurable, but they have stuff they're doing because they've realized it's a huge problem for them when they scale these massive org sizes. So it's clear there's a need for free tooling that can be brought out and leveraged throughout the community. And frankly, we're also seeing it in developer experience surveys where people are saying this is a huge headache. So I love we're diving in here, but for teams who are considering starting to use programmable workflows, and hopefully trying to fix their code review process or other parts of their processes, what are the headaches or challenges with getting started?
Yeah, one thing there's been a few use cases that we've seen have been fairly consistent. One of them that I think is a great first bite out of this is identifying, or it's building code expertise and then assigning those experts to be the reviewer on relevant PRs. So you always got to consider the bus factor. You don't want to have a single person that's always in charge of reviewing everything because it creates bottlenecks. What happens when they're out of the office or you can't get them because they have other priorities. So a lot of organizations are looking for ways to both or implement policies that enable their team to share knowledge across the organization, and then once that has been distributed, giving them empowering them to take reviews into their own hands rather than having to depend on a select few. So that's been a very obvious one. In terms of compliance, there's a lot of concern about one thing that one use case that comes up in SOC 2 is making sure that you're tracking every change that goes into your code base in some sort of centralized repository, whether it's your project management or some other BI solution. And developers, once again, developers they hate going into Jira, but they need to say this PR is part of this project over here, and if you can do that without forcing them to constantly have to have multiple tabs open, switch back and forth,
provide some automation,
get URLs, just automate all of that away. And it's a toil that developers just they don't want to do. They have to do it. They can sort of take off their hands. So those are the two major use cases. But I mean, we really see just very broad adoption. But there's a lot of small, low-hanging fruit, small things that you can just implement just to make your developers' lives a little bit easier.
Is this thing like integrating into the testing suite or CI/CD and trying to apply that? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, if you have a CI pipeline that maybe you have too many jobs, or maybe you have so many jobs that you don't need them for every PR, but maybe your developers are waiting on them for every PR, that you're just wasting their time waiting for something that may not be relevant. So why not skip a few of them and or only trigger them if they're necessary for the code that's being changed.
What I'm hearing you say is that gitStream is facilitating programmable workflows that not only cut down on manual effort, but also facilitate faster feedback loops. Would that be an accurate way to describe it?
Yeah, so we can do things like estimate how much time it's going to take to review a PR. So you're a developer, you got a meeting in 15 minutes, you think, well, maybe I can go look at a PR real quick and help one of my teammates, and then you open it up and find out it's 500 lines of code that have changed across a dozen files and multiple subsystems, and all you wish is I just wish I could unsee this so that I can go back to the rest of my day and get on with my life.
Yeah.
But if you could tell them, there's that one, that's a big one, so save that for when you have time. There's this other one over here that maybe it's smaller. It will only take a couple minutes to review. It's a really great way to just help your teammate out super fast. So there's stuff like that. There's, finding when someone is, maybe accidentally using some deprecated APIs or something, maybe you have somebody in the review process that's going to catch that, but why bother them? Why not just catch it automatically ahead of time and let the developer know immediately so they have that immediate feedback about what needs to change.
Reduces the context switching piece, lets people make immediate changes. Makes total sense. How are you going about adoption for programmable workflows? I know it can be a big change for some teams. What do you do to really get folks to buy in and actually get their leadership to get on board with these big changes?
Yeah, find your pain point, your biggest one, and just solve for it and start there. And then just go down the list, find the next biggest one and so on and so forth. A great place to look first is Dora. get some Dora metrics in place so that you know sort of how you benchmark against other organizations, where you might have the biggest slowdowns. I wouldn't be surprised if you find that, like we've predicted, it's often in the pickup and review time. But if it's not, there's other practices that you can take. But Dora, that's one of the great things about Dora is it's a really great like value-oriented framework that leads to these sort of natural technological solutions that solve the problems.
Yeah, and I'll say we were listening to Nicole Forsgren talk earlier too about extending that and kind of applying the space framework and saying, okay, like you've started with Dora, what's the next step for you? Is it maybe you should be paying attention to your PR review sizes? Maybe that's a really crucial early indicator for you. Or maybe it's developer happiness through your DevX surveys. It's like a key North Star metric for you. And I think that's a great way to think about it and say, okay, like let's identify the things in our cycle that we want to move faster, and then we can apply tooling to reduce those friction points, try to speed it up and make our developers' lives easier. And I think an underrated aspect of this is that if you apply these programmable workflows well, you're actually going to make your dev team feel better about what they're doing too. It's less of the work they don't want to deal with. It's less context switching. You're going to have more good days for them. And that opportunity is great for recruitment. It's great for retention. It's great for productivity. I love to hear it. Do you have an idea of where you see GitStream going next, though?
Going next. Our goal has always been sort of maximal extensibility. We want to be sort of a glue in between just about every other tool in your developer stack. So that's definitely a direction that we're going. And we also, we really, I want to touch on a couple points you mentioned there, because, there's one common theme I've heard so far at this event is, developer well-being. Like it's a very big concern. And a lot of those conversations have been centered around things like, for example, the McKinsey metrics that focus more on like effort and output rather than like any sort of like value stream like changes. And I think there's a lot of concern that those sorts of approaches don't really take the developer quality of life into account.
They often don't.
Yeah, and I feel like that's where Dora plus space is really trying to account for. It's like the metrics that quantify the challenges that you're facing, like that feels kind of in the Dora realm. And then I don't really know if they're metrics or if it's just more of a mindset.
The framework to apply to decide on what you want to measure next.
Yeah. And that focuses much more on just your organizational well-being, because we know happy developers do better, they're more productive, they ship software faster, So I feel like it is almost like a response to, we don't want to analyze developers in a way that makes them feel pressured.
Right.
So and I feel like GitStream is a natural solution to that, because we're not telling you this is the tool that's going to increase the number of lines of code you change. We're telling you this is a tool that's going to unblock things that you might be struggling with.
Ideally, it should reduce gamification of metrics, because I know that's a big concern for a lot of engineering leaders, and it's a valid concern. Goodhart's law says that when you start setting goals against measurements, you're going to see them improve, but it's a lot easier to create one 10-pound nail than a million small nails. So you're like, great, I need to create 10 pounds of nails. Let's do one big one. You didn't specify. And that gamification is not what we want to see. We want to see a process that moves faster and works better for everyone. Yep. And so GitStream's a great way to say, let's put tools in the hands of developers where they can set the process up in the way that they need to have it done, and also fulfill the needs of the C-suite and say, okay, great, now policy is code for compliance, awesome. And now we have higher efficiency throughout our pipeline, fantastic. We deliver more software faster, more predictively. But ideally, it needs to be one where we're putting it in the hands of devs and making their lives easier. And so I love that approach is being taken.
Where we can surface those insights to the managers, so we can say, they can log into, like, say, their LinearB dashboard, get their Dora metrics, and within that see some sort of like breadcrumb that says, we've detected that there's an issue over here. There are automations that you could implement to solve that, or maybe we have some knowledge-based resources that are beneficial. So
obviously, I think we're both just big fans of programmable workflow tooling, and I know we're talking about LinearB's GitStream in particular. It's free, it's available. What are some of the integrations that are set up already in GitStream that people can start to leverage?
So we've been hard at work building out a pretty robust integrations marketplace. Like I mentioned, we really want to be the glue between a lot of popular developer technologies. So we're looking at your project management stacks, whether you use Jira or Asana or Shortcut. We're finding ways to integrate with those. We recently built some integrations with, one of my favorites, our new integrations with GitHub Actions, which lets you like orchestrate your CI pipelines effectively. So you can decide that, if let's say this code changes my mobile app only, well, I only need the mobile build process for that. So I can choose to ignore the rest and just run the processes that I need. So that's a huge time saver that I'm really happy we were able to ship. We also have now enabled outgoing webhooks, so you're able to connect gitStream to practically any service that has an API. So if you want to send Slack notifications, if you want to auto-update Jira tickets, if you want to send a PagerDuty alert, whatever tool you want to send some sort of alert from your Git repo or from a PR, we can now enable that. So, this list is only going to grow. I encourage people, if they want to check out what we're doing, just to check out docs.gitstream.cm, where we're building out all of our integrations.
Fantastic. Ben, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thanks for giving us an update on what's happening in programmable workflow land. Very excited to see where this goes in the next couple of years. To your point earlier, I think it's a crucial thing that we're seeing being called for in a lot of enterprises. This has been a lot of fun, and especially doing in front of this live audience, people walking around us here in the Dome, DevOps Enterprise Summit in Las Vegas. Thanks for listening, anyone. And if you are interested in GitStream, as Ben mentioned, docs.gitstream.cm to learn all about it. You can add it to your GitHub right now. And thanks so much for writing out this great docs, Ben. Thanks for coming on the pod, and we'll have you back in soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
And if you're listening to this and you want to see Ben and I flail around, accidentally hit mic stands, maybe have some bloopers in here, we'll hopefully edit some of those out. Check us out on YouTube. We'll put the clips on LinkedIn as well, but you'll definitely find the full video on YouTube. It's a lot more fun to kind of see the experience of what we're doing here. So thanks so much for listening, y'all.